But of course the Carrolls did exactly here what they did up the north. They fought with everybody, fought among themselves, but I suppose in particular they fought with the English and were the bane of the English, and ended up being one of the last of the Gaelic clans to be dispossessed. And that didn't happen until 1690, which was the year of the Battle of Boyne, in fact. But the site itself, though, had an earlier history. It's recorded in the annals of the Four Masters that, and they were started in 1150, that there were wooden towers on this site. Now, they don't say whether they were just lookout towers or whether they were wooden castles or not. Wooden castles weren't uncommon in Ireland. They were quite common, in fact. But now, neither do they tell us how far back or prior to that they did. So we only know as far as that. But what we do know, though, is since the earliest times, and just since the first people came to Ireland, they used this as a ceremonial site. Not that we know much about them now. They were, we know they were hunter-gatherers anyway. They were sun worshippers as well, and fire was very important in their ceremony. Now, whether it was part of the ceremony or a beacon to call people, I suppose we'll never really know. But if it was just a beacon, from this site we can see back to the River Shannon on a clear day, on a good day. So it would have been a great beacon to call people from huge distances at that time, you know. And that's nearly as much as we know about them until, excuse me. Now, those people probably walked here as well, because when the ices melted here on the island, there was still, of course, all the rest of Europe was covered in ice, so the sea was much lower. So with land bridge, with the rest through England and across to Europe. So more than likely these people walked here, these first people. But the next wave of people arrived then, I suppose, would have been the farmers, the first farmers that came about 3,500 to 4,000 BC, and they continued to use this as a ceremonial site. Now their ceremonies would have been different. There were fertility ceremonies, but fertility of their cattle, because this was the beginning, I suppose, of the great cattle culture of Ireland. And one probably, well, you could say that it's still a cattle culture here, because our greatest industry would be cattle and cattle products and dairy products. In the Republic, I suppose, here we would have nearly 4 million people, but we'd have 10, 11 million cattle. Now, the difference nowadays is that we don't have so many people involved. In former times, everybody was a cattleman, like, you know, everybody knew cattle. So these farmers continued to use this site up then until the Christian era, the arrival of the first missionaries here, and that would be in the 5th century, the middle of the 5th century, and then of course that all changed, and I suppose the conversion wasn't very easy. We weren't an easy crowd to convert at all. They had great difficulty. What they normally did was they would come to sites like this, or most of where you see, well, most of where the monasteries are in Ireland, the early Irish monasteries now, not the European ones, would have been on a pre-Christian site. Because what they did was they came into these important pagan sites, I suppose, which were either ceremonial or what we call pattern sites, and adopted the ways and adapted the ways. They adopted even the deities. Like we say the Roman Catholics in Ireland, most of the early saints would have been actually pre-Christian pagan deities that the first Christians adopted and made saints out of. Because, as I said, it wasn't easy to convert and change at all, like, you know. So that was kind of the early. So they would have done the same here as well on this site and came and taken over this site. But as I said, then the first instance of building, well, the first record would be about 1150, and then they continued after that. So the castle itself, the stone castle here, as I said, was built in the early 1300s, but the O'Carrolls had a perfectly good castle up on the hill just over us here. And there's no real reason that we know of, other than it was a display of power and wealth that they moved down here and built this castle, because we found in a lot of this castle there's perfectly good cut stones that came out of another building, used as building stones in it. So in a way it's probably an early recycled castle in a way, like, you know. So they built it here because it overlooks a valley. It's on the edge of a cliff, It overlooks a valley that had one of the important roadways in the Middle Ages. And of course, they being a cattle culture, where you had cattle on roads, you were going to have cattle raiders. So you'd call them rustlers in your country, but it was hugely important as a lookout as well as being a defensive castle. And it's quite primitive, as you can see. The walls are pretty thick on them. It's quite deceiving, in fact, because there's quite a big facade, but it's quite small inside because, well, the thickness of the walls, but also it's just built along the edge of a cliff too, like, so it's a long, narrow building. The wings that you see on either side, well, the immediate Gothic wings, they started to build those in 1750. Now, there are ruins of earlier houses, of course, further down, and there's, like you might even notice Tudor chimneys and that, they were Elizabethan and that, you know. So, in the 1400s, we know that this was a town. It was called Ballycarroll, or the town of the O'Carrolls, and it had a licence for a cattle market once a month, so it was an important town of about 1,000 people. But of course that all changed then, like in the early 1600s, there was an Anglo-Irish family married in here by the name of Darby, and they, of course, well, I mean, England had taken over here anyway, the plantation, this was all part of Munster, see, and the plantation of Munster, and that England took over here. And when those first Anglo-Irish, well, they weren't Anglo-Irish then, they became known as Anglo-Irish after that, but these English people by the name of Darby married in. After that, there was no need for the defensive thing anymore. There was no one to defend it against anyway, and they were all part of the establishment anyway. So they set about building the wings, and so they demolished what was known as the barn. The barn was an enclosure, a fortified enclosure. Normally, a castle was built, and then there was fortified walls built all around it. The castle would have been known as a donjon in the middle. But because this was on a cliff, it was so easy to defend on this side. They brought the walls into either side of it here. But anyway, they demolished those. They didn't need them, so they used the stone to build the wings on either side. and that was it. They also built, we say, the walls you see around now, gatehouses and that. They became very involved in the development of high farming in the 1700s when they were trying to develop better fodder